E rere kau mai te awa, mai e takahui maunga ki Tangaroa, ko wau te awa, ko te awa, ko wau. The river flows from the mountain to the sea. I am the river, and the river is me.
From the slopes of Mount Tongariro to the Tasmanian Sea flows New Zealand's longest river, the Wanganui. The fight for social and environmental justice mounted by the Wanganui iwi against the many powerful forces that sought to control these storied waters, and the final act, which saw the river become a legal person, is as long and complicated as the river itself. This is the story of the Te Awa Tupawa Act.
Inland from the sea in the northern island of New Zealand lies a desert plateau. From this plateau rise giant volcanic mountains, and from these mountains flow many rivers. For generations the Maoris have told of gods who dwell in these mountains and of the legend of the Whanganui River. The Maoris say many mountains once stood here, and one of these was Taranaki. But isolated from his brothers, Mount Taranaki now stands far away beside the Western Sea, and the path of his journey from the center of the island down to the sea is marked by the deep gorges of the Whanganui River. The river begins high in the mountains, but to the Maori people it begins in the mists that swirl around the peaks and along the valleys. It begins in the mists in the sky above. Born of snow and mountain springs, the river speaks. River of legend called Whanganui that the Maoris use as a water highway. Along the valley of the Whanganui once lived thousands of brown-skinned men, Maoris of the tribes of Ngāpairangi and Ngāpa Moana. They came in the great Polynesian migrations of the 13th century. For 200 miles, the Whanganui flows westward, down the traditional pathway of the ancient god Taranaki, through uninhabited hills and dense bush valleys where the river seems to lose its way, where mists linger long after the early morning's first warmth reaches the valleys, and where birds, the tuis and koromikos, sing all day in giant tree ferns and tall matais. All the river was theirs, its bush, its birds and fish, its deep refreshing waters. To all Maoris, the Whanganui was a common highway leading to the plains of the interior and a pathway down to summer fishing camps by the sea. For centuries, the tribes of Aotea daydreamed on its waters, listening to the song of the tui, studying every leaf and fern, and weaving legends around the whirlpools and rapids of the enchanted river.
In 1841, European settlers began arriving in sailing ships, and the river started to get much busier.
Up the river came the white man, and with the white man came red nightcaps, razor blades, and rifles. And with rifles, tribal wars became deadlier. Some Maoris fought Pākehā, and the river ran with blood. But within a generation, the war drums that echoed down the gorges had gone.
I think perhaps that you should say a few words in the New Zealand language. It would be appropriate, Governor.
Nothing complicated.
What does it mean?
6 February 1840, Maori and the Crown signed what was known as the Treaty of Waitangi. It's the opposite of the Declaration of Independence in the United States. Under that treaty, the Maori recognised the sovereignty of the British Crown, became British subjects with exactly the same rights as an Englishman had in terms of the rule of law.
The treaty is fundamental because it establishes that interdependence, which is such a fundamental corollary of our understanding of independence. It established the framework in which people who come here could have a relationship with us.
And let me be clear, I think the Treaty of Waitangi is a wonderful document. There are plenty of people who don't like the treaty for one reason or another, particularly European New Zealanders. They feel there was something bad about the treaty. On the contrary, I think it was a tremendous document.
I think the deal in Māori was quite clear, but the difficulty is that the deal in English was quite different.
But I'm dismayed at the extent to which it is now being reinterpreted to mean something which was never intended at the time.
The treaty to me has never been about treaty rights. It's always been about the rightness that comes from people accepting their obligations to each other. And that was a profound and, I think, visionary base upon which to build a country.
I think there's implication that the treaty was in some sense a partnership between the Crown and Maori chiefs. There's nothing about partnership in the treaty.
They were talking about tino rangatiratanga on the one hand, which the Queen was kind of supporting and agreeing to, and kāwanatanga, which they were giving to the Queen, which on just about all readings now, I think, people agree was kind of agreeing to have a governor.
On the contrary, the first article of the treaty makes it unambiguously clear that chiefs were ceding sovereignty to the Queen. There was no partnership involved in that at all. And I think the modern reinterpretation of the treaty is quite wrong.
The role of a sovereign is at a level that is far higher than the role of a governor. And so to use kāwanatanga as a sort of translation equivalent for sovereignty doesn't work.
The bush was felled and burnt and gave way to grassland for cattle and sheep. Sheltered valleys and rising slopes above the river proved ideal for stock. The ancient hunting and cultivating grounds of the Maori disappeared.
The need for improved transport caught the attention of one Alexander Hattrick. Hattrick had already established a shipping service between Whanganui and Sydney and was well aware of the growing need for a reliable riverboat service. The first experiments at running riverboats at Pipirihi were made by the military in 1865, and this was quickly followed by a private service in 1866. However, the enterprise was ahead of its time and used the wrong type of vessels for the river conditions and was consequently short-lived. Yarrow and Company in London had designed some craft specifically for shallow river work, and from 1892 Hattrick began purchasing a number of Yarrow's paddle and propeller-driven vessels. Excursions up the river to Ha'apango Park were popular, and crowded decks were the norm. Success came swiftly to Alexander Hattrick, and in 1892 his company secured a mail contract with the government. Shortly afterwards, he entered a contract carrying passengers to Pipirihi for Thomas Cook and Son. In 1903, Hattrick extended the route through to Taumaranui. For the overnight stays, Hattrick acquired a luxurious hotel at Pipirihi and constructed a large houseboat, which he moored near the Ohura River. This was before the completion of the railway between Wellington and Auckland, and it became a preferred option for travellers, as the only other practical route was by sea. The shallow draft riverboats were not only used for passengers, but moved farm produce such as wool. Without these versatile rivercraft, getting the heavy wool bales to the seaports for export would have been near impossible.
Every summer out of the shearing sheds comes the Whanganui wool clip on its journey to the river mouth. In settlements along the banks live the Maoris left on the river, farming sheep and cattle. And over their old canoe routes travel the wool-laden steamers. Steamers now ply where once Maori warriors swept along in 100-man canoes. And to the bush valleys come tourists from other lands, speeding through rapids and rock-bound gorges under the sure hand of a Maori helmsman.
The early 1960s saw the first commercial use of a Hamilton twin-jet craft. The Rangi Mairi was purpose-built for the task of providing a sightseeing service on the river.
The Whanganui flows out from the hills across the flats towards the coast. Soon the river deepens. Ahead lies the river mouth city of Whanganui, meeting place for town and country. Here live the people of the coast who serve the town and farming district. Shopkeepers and freezing workers, wool brokers and shipping agents. Men with a stake in the river, as the Maori had when he fished for eels and hunted in the bush that stood on these banks a century ago.
In my time, I've seen when this city of 40,000 plus people was putting their sewage directly into the river. That's what I grew up with. Somebody has to be responsible, and there is certainly something bigger that this country's psyche hasn't come to grips with.
The New Zealand-invented jet boat or turbocraft is rapidly opening up new waters for navigation in many parts of the world.
The narrow gorges have gone, and on the coastal flats, wool stores and cold storage buildings hold beef, mutton and butter awaiting shipment to the other side of the world. To Britain, America, France and Russia. Signs and signals beckon ships in from the sea. The river is hardly a river any longer. Behind the port lies the coastal town of Whanganui, and here, working alongside the Pākehā, are the river Maoris of today. Some wearing their army berets from Tunisia and El Alamein. But now the river hurries no more, and beyond lies the sea.
the 1950s, New Zealand's population was growing rapidly, and demand for electricity was increasing. To meet this demand, a decision was made by the government to build the Tongariro Power Scheme, using water from the Moafango, Whangaehu, Tongariro and Whanganui catchments. Construction of the power scheme was a large job. It took from 1960 to 1983 to complete, and now harnesses the water of 36 streams and rivers, including 4 lakes over an area of 2,600 square kilometres.
This town, Turangi, was built as the centre of the Tongariro power development. Briefly, this is a scheme for diverting water which flows from the central volcanic mountains, Ruapehu, Ngaruahoe and Tongariro, and to the east from the Kaimanawa Ranges. The scheme is in 3 stages, the first of which is the western diversion, which leads water from the headwaters of Wanganui into Lake Rotoaira. Stages 2 and 3 combined bring water through a short tunnel and a long canal into Rotoaira, and the water is diverted through a 3 3/4 mile long tunnel to a power station at Tukanu. The watershed area serving the scheme is in excess of 1,000 square miles. In the scheme itself, tunnelling will total 27 miles, canals add up to a further 14 miles, and there are 4 small dams and 1 large 200-foot high concrete dam. The total workforce engaged on the scheme would be in the nature of 1,500, and these are scattered over the whole area with controlling points at Tauraiwa, Poutu, Tukanu and Moafonga.
All the water collected from the eastern side of the scheme will be brought to Lake Rotoaira along a canal being built across volcanic pumice country. Before the canal is excavated, hills must be levelled and the pumice used to span across valleys. As New Zealand's cities and manufacturing industries grow, so does the need for power and the challenge of harnessing increasingly difficult sources of supply. From the Tongariro River, construction roads have been built into the steep country of the Kaimanawa Ranges. At times, these roads have had to be cut down into the pumice of past volcanic eruptions. At Rangipo, deep in a side valley off the Tongariro River, a small exploratory tunnel is being driven to find the possible location for a subsidiary underground power station. At the same time, high on the hillside above, a drill rig pushes steadily down into the often fractured strata of the rock 600 and 700 feet below. From the cores brought up will come the information geologists need to calculate whether or not to go ahead on this site. But all the time, canals, dams, and work at the main powerhouse site is progressing. And through the several years of construction, repair and maintenance must keep pace. The Ministry of Works, who are building the Tongariro power scheme for the New Zealand Electricity Department, have their central workshops on the outskirts of Turangi. Because much of the country covered is pumice land, which can turn from deep mud to penetrating dust in dry weather, heavy equipment and machines need a lot of maintenance. In an adjoining workshop, the penstock sections are assembled. A special transporter had to be built for the job of getting the completed pipeline sections up to the top of the penstock slope. It's a long, slow pull to climb more than 400 feet to the place where the tunnel carrying the combined waters of the power scheme from Lake Rotoara will emerge from the hillside. Not only will these waters supply Tongariro, but they will also boost the output of 8 other stations beyond this scheme down the Waikato River. The active nature of this country, with hot springs and pools at Tukanu only a mile or so away, leads to unusual problems in the excavating of the powerhouse site. To win power from the volcanic plateau means combating the very forces which formed it. Thermal activity and heat, humid heat in the nearby tunnel being driven 24 hours a day back through the mountain to bring the lake water to the powerhouse. and toil at 85 degrees. The men work 3 shifts. From midnight to 8 in the morning, the graveyard shift is the least popular, and the day shift, which ends at 4 in the afternoon, the most conventional. Because of this, tunnellers' shifts change every week. But administrative staff and others keep to more normal hours. While Turangi has a large number of family homes, its single quarters are typical of more isolated construction camps. The Tongariro River, which flows into Lake Taupo, is known to anglers round the world for its rainbow trout. Because some of its water is being diverted for the scheme, project engineers have had to ensure that enough will be left in the river to safeguard it for anglers in the years ahead. One problem has been the protection of the vital Tokanu spawning stream, which passes within only a few hundred yards of the power station excavations. In these streams, clear running water is vital for the hatching of young trout. Another spawning stream actually goes under the Potu Canal, where a special culvert has been designed, with ridges to break the smooth flow of water, so the trout can still make their way upstream. Fish ladders have also been installed where the natural levels of streams have been altered. While near Lake Rotuara, a complex culvert will allow trout to pass beneath the drop structures of yet another canal. Not far from the lake, old Maori war trenches are being examined as part of the salvage archaeology, which is now a standard part of construction projects in historic areas. The scheme to the west of the Central Mountains crosses a plain where deep cuts are being made to carry the water towards a desolate swampland. Here a dredge toils at the long job of gouging out a channel, slowly filling in the surrounding swamp with silt. While on completed sections of the canal are starts made on the job of mulching the bare earth with chopped straw and sowing with grass. The healing of construction scars or restoration landscaping is an important part of a scheme where acres of land have had to be stripped to fill in valleys and places found for countless tons of excavated rock and earth from tunnels and canals. Italians, and many brought their families with them, came to New Zealand with the Milan firm of Codelfa Cogefa, which won the 22-mile contract for the greatest length of tunnelling on the scheme. Some of the Italian construction sites are almost lost in deep gorges in the middle of bush country, cut by swift rivers like the Whakapapa, which will be diverted through 10 miles of tunnel. With these men came traditions like the Feast of St. Barbara, patron saint of tunnellers. A shrine to St. Barbara protects each tunnel entrance. In contrast to the main tunnel being driven from Lake Rotuara to the Penstock Slope, the Italian tunnels are smaller in diameter and difficult to work in. Since the work started, there have been several major cave-ins and falls of loose rock. Sometimes conditions are so bad that low pilot drives are pushed ahead first, and progress slowed to a mere 2 or 3 hard-won feet a day. The Italians are working in 2 tunnels on the west of the scheme and in a 12-mile-long tunnel to the east. Yet even with the most modern equipment, unstable conditions often force them to slow to the pace of pick and shovel. However, at one working face, a 95-ton machine has been installed that bites at the fractured rock with gigantic jaws. Pushing through the tunnels will go on 24 hours a day until the Tongariro scheme is completed. The power of rivers from more than 1,000 square miles of country will be harnessed and led for much of the way underground in one of New Zealand's most imaginative engineering undertakings.
The water for the scheme flows from these waterways through a vast network of dams, man-made canals, and water tunnels up to 19 kilometres long. Within the scheme, there are 3 power stations: Mangaio, the underground Rangipo station, and the Tokanu station. Combined, they produce around 3.5% of New Zealand's total annual electricity. This is enough electricity to power a city the size of Hamilton. The Tokanu power station is the brains of the operation and has a generation control team who work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, running the entire power scheme as well as the power stations at Waikare Moana and Lake Tekapo in the South Island. The Tongariro power scheme covers an area so large it is divided into 4 sections: the Western Diversion, the Eastern Diversion, the Tongariro section, and the Rotoaira section. The Western Diversion draws water from 6 tributaries of the Upper Whanganui River and uses a 16.5 kilometre tunnel to take water through to Lake Te Whāia. From there, the water flows through a canal to the man-made lake Otamangako and down the Wairehu Canal to Lake Rotoaira. Minimum flows are maintained below our intakes on several streams for fuel. Our iconic blue duck. These birds indicate healthy high country streams and now thrive on the Western Diversion. The Eastern Diversion includes water from the Wahianoa Aqueduct, which has 22 intakes. From there, the water passes into the man-made lake Moawhango. Water is then taken through a tunnel to the Rangipo Dam on the Tongariro River. The Tongariro section uses water from the eastern diversion, the Waihohonu stream, and the Tongariro River catchment, with water tunnelled directly from the Rangipo Dam to the underground Rangipo Power Station. The Rangipo Power Station was built underground to minimise the environmental impacts on the surrounding forest park. Water from the Rangipo Power Station is then discharged back to the Tongariro River at Poutu Intake. Water is diverted at the intake via Poutu Canal to Lake Rotoaira. A flow on the river is maintained downstream of the intake for recreational activities such as rafting, kayaking, fishing, and for aquatic river habitat. The Rotoaira section is central to the whole scheme, as it's where the eastern and western diversion waters converge at Lake Rotoaira. This water then flows into the Tokanu intake, down through the tunnels and penstocks to the Tokanu Power Station, and out the man-made tail race to Lake Taupo. Once electricity is generated at the power stations, it must pass through a transformer contained in an outdoor switchyard to make it compatible for distribution on the national grid. Local network providers then distribute the electricity to consumers throughout the country. It then powers factories in Hamilton and porch lights in Taupo.
A trip up the Whanganui became a celebrated tourist attraction, drawing visitors from around the world. However, the extensive clearance of the bush-clad interior caused eroded land to fill the river, and it soon became impassable to large vessels.
And others are saying that the land was sold and that they have a deed to prove that it was sold. We dispute that deed.
There was a law passed in 1894 called the Validation of Invalid Land Sales Act, which said that no matter how Pākehā got Māori land up until that time, whether it was legal or illegal, under Pākehā law henceforth became legal.
But behind the political posturing were a group of determined kuia, determined to use the past to help the future of their people.
Are you a radical?
No, I'm not a radical. I know what I'm doing because I believe in myself. This is belong to us.
It just blows me away to know that our people are out here fighting.
When you carry the weight of your ancestors, it's not an easy position to be in. in one sense you feel them supporting you, the old people, those who have gone on. In the other sense, sometimes you can carry the heaviness of it. The river, or how we would refer to it, the Awa Tupua, we see it as a living entity that carries our ancestors, that carries their memories. It's a metaphor for our history. We're very much connected physically, spiritually, and even our philosophies very much come from being a people of the river. Right?
In the metaphor of the iron and the clay, who is the iron and who is the clay?
Iron is a way of thinking or a mentality that may be disconnected from the earth. Iron could be seen as that which is introduced, as the fences that divided the land, whereas clay represents the earth. And sometimes you see this antagonism, this tension, the iron as it was introduced, clashing with te uku, the clay. Two worldviews colliding, eh?
Today, the river and its lands are used for farming, forestry, and tourism. But decades of poor logging and agricultural practices have taken a toll on the Wanganui and its watershed, a well-known fact to both Maori and those of non-Maori descent.
If they hadn't cut a lot of that bush down, there wouldn't be so much debris coming down the river. And if they hadn't cut that bush down, the river wouldn't have flooded so much. Today, because of all the land development and the erosion problems, it's crazy. The environment is getting hammered.
Au te awa ko te awa ko au. Tata ki te kotahi rau e 50 tau a te ati hau nui a Pāpārangi e whakahau ana i te karauna kia whakahokia te mana whakahaere o te awa o Whanganui ki a rātou. Nō te rānei i tutuki ai tō rātou wawata i raro i te whakataunga tiriti e hāngai pū ana ki te awa o Whanganui.
Ko au te awa ko te awa ko au, ki te tūkino koe i te awa, e tūkino ana koe i au.
E ana tēnei awa i te wai noi o, i te kirikiri noi o, engari e tupuna aia e mana tōna.
Ko ta paina te kremena e ko ruruku whakatupua te mana o te awa tupua, ko tōna ito e hāngai pū ana ki te awa o Whanganui. I nāia nei ka tapatahi te iwi, te karauna, te kaunihera me te hapori ki te āta poipoi i aia.
Kia kore e parungia, kia kore rā, e taka ia e ngā tikanga o tēnā, o tēnā. Nō reira, koe nā oki rā, teire i ratanga o tēnei rā.
$80 million as the quantum, and then a $30 million clean-up fund. There's also some cultural redress. It's a very significant settlement.
Tata ki te kotahi rau 50 tau te ati haunui a Pāpārangi e whai ana kia whakamanatia tōna tupuna. Hioe mai rā nō te karauna e takahi ana i te awa tupua he tūraki i ngā pātuna me ngā utu piharau. He tango waro i tōna waiawa, he whakawātea whenua kia māmā te whakatere tima. He tūrakitanga i tōna oranga.
Tā koe ki ake, ko te hea o te karauna, kaore ai te mōio. E a tēnei awa, ko ai aia, e a tōna reo.
You can go back through all the various law reports and see cases persistently brought by Wanganui River iwi to the Maori Appellate Court, to the Court of Appeal most recently 50 years ago.
I tā mokongia te kreme ki te marae o rāna nei i Whanganui, nā tamakehu ka moia ruaka, ka puta ki waho ko ngā tini uri o te hawa tupua, NZ Pikia, te karere.
What I was supposed to do on behalf of the government was negotiate a settlement between the state and the Indigenous people of New Zealand of the Wanganui River claims. This is a river where there have been lots of debates over who owns the bed of the river, what needs to be done to improve the status of the river or the condition of the river. One of the highlights of my time was getting in a jet boat and going down the river with some of the leaders of the Wanganui River. The jet boat was going about 30 knots and the rain was coming at me at about 30 knots, so it wasn't the most enjoyable experience from a touristic point of view, but I sure learned a lot.
Maybe you connected with it a little bit there.
I don't know, I certainly was connecting with the rain.
The New Zealand government realized it needed to address the wrongs inflicted on the Maori. Could recognizing both nature's rights and those of the indigenous Maori people provide a solution to a century-old conflict?
In terms of the New Zealand recognition of the rights of nature, we were dealing with a number of these settlements and dealing with the aspirations of the various tribes. And then we had to say, well, if we transfer the river or ownership of the river to the local iwi, it'll be World War III. And if we transferred a national park, or what had been a national park, to the iwi, there would be trouble, because people would say we were giving away something that was their birthright. And so we had to try and explore ways in which we could reach just and durable settlements without getting ourselves into trouble. I mean, good old politics at its best. And fortunately, the various groups that we were dealing with provided the answer. Get away from Western concepts of ownership into something else, and recognizing that maybe the river just owns itself. Maybe the forest, the uruweras, own themselves.
No te rangi nei whakamanahia e te ture I te pire o te awa tupua. Koe nei te whakataunga tiriti kua roarawa e whakahaeretia na ia o te aroa, ko ruruku whakatupua te ingoa o te whakataunga nei. He utu mo te nui o ngā takahitanga o te tiriti o Waitangi I te kore whakai kia whakahaeretia, kia whakamahiara nei te iwi te awa o Whanganui. Kia titiroa ke ki ngā kaupapa matua o te whakataunga nei. No te tau ko tahi mano warurau whitu te kau te peti hanga nā rangatira kia whakahokia te mana o te awa mai te karauna. He waru te kaumātahi miliona tāra ka utua I tēnei whakataunga. He toru te kau miliona tāra anō ki te whakaara I te rōpu koro tete, ko rātau kariro I te mana mo te whakapaiake I te awa. I te whare anō tō mātau teo tōranga pua e ruera rerekura e mātaki ana ina whakahaerenga o te rā, kia whakawhiti atu kia aia eru.
Tēnā koe rapaira, kua roa nei ngā iwi o Whanganui e whanga ana mo tēnei rā. Ko te mea nui kia rātou, haunga rā te pūtea, kua whakapūmautia e te whare pārimata tōna mana motuhake o te awa o Whanganui. Rangona te whare pārimata e ngā manu tioriori o te awa tupua o Whanganui. Koe nei te rā kua wakamanatia te awa.
I roti ngā tau kotai, rau, e rima te kau, kua oai anō o ki rā te kaua o tau itorangi I ngā ture, I ngā ritenga o tauiwi, ana kua uri, kua oka tika ina I ruti tēnei rā, ana tōna oka ira tanga tēnā.
Ai tāna nō, kua pai te maitai me te mineta take tiritia Chris Phillison kia e ai te kaupapa.
E tangata pono ki ana mai, e arei te mea, e tangata oka ii, e kimi nei I ta mana mōna ake I ruti tēnei āua. No mai rano, ana koe tēnā I tu aipau, mo te karauna I roti tēnei mai.
I want to acknowledge the leaders and the Trust Board members, many of whom have passed away, and I particularly remember, as indeed we all do, the great and late Sir Archie Taiaroa, who had such a wonderful vision for Te Awa Tupua.
Ko te mea nui o te ture awa tupua, ko wakaturi ia te awa ai awa tupua, ai tangata no oki, e mana tō te awa.
Because it means that the river itself has the right not to be polluted. It has the right not to be degraded. It has the right not to be overdrawn before it can replenish itself.
And when I quote this particular bill, sir, they are in absolute awe as to how we have actually associated a river, a mighty river, and given it the identity of a person.
Me uri te aro o tauiwi, o te karauna, ngā kauni e raro me moi o rātau ki te aua tuturu. Te aua e moi o tia I tō taua mātua.
I oi ko tauri te aro I naenei ki te whenua, ko whai mana te Whanganui Land Settlement Negotiation Trust ki te whakawhitiwhiti kōrero me te karauna.
The Wanganui River will soon have 2 jointly appointed human representatives, one nominated by the Crown and one by Wanganui Iwi.
Former Minister Dame Tariana Turia and educator Turama Hawera will act as the human face of the river to ensure its rights are protected.
Obviously, the river itself wouldn't go into court. It is represented by a number of people. The key thing is the legislation settles all the historical claims that had been brought against the Crown going back over 100 years.
When we were negotiating with the Crown, we said that we need to find an approximation at law to how we view and hold this river. And so legal personhood was the closest approximation we could find. We knew that saying that the river was both physical and spiritual wasn't going to be enough. We needed to define what that is.
Section 12, the recognition of the river as an indivisible and living whole, incorporating all its physical and metaphysical elements. And so people may well look at that and say, what planet are these New Zealanders living on? Whakatoki, the great river, flows from the mountains to the sea. We now have an arrangement which will be an enduring arrangement and is the start of something very, very special.
It's the first river in the world to be granted the legal status of a person, possibly the only river to have its own Twitter account, but locals say the Whanganui River would be in better shape if the Tongariro power scheme wasn't taking its headwaters. The former Mayor, Annette Main, says the river looks dirty because of the silt in it, and the Genesis Energy-owned hydro dam makes it difficult for the river to clean itself. Lee Marama McLaughlin went to the river and filed this report.
For more than 20 years, Trevor Gibson has been sailing the Waimarie pedal steamboat up and down the Whanganui River. As the 82-year-old sets off today, he says he's seen a lot of changes to the river since he moved here in 1950.
You can see all this is erosion, that's going back over there about 10 metres over the years. It's just eaten right in on the side there.
And how does that affect the river?
Well, it slows it down a little bit.
A recent freshwater report from the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor Sir Peter Gluckman found that hydro dams can change the environment, including slowing the flow of rivers and causing erosion. Trevor Gibson says that's definitely the case with the Whanganui River.
When they put in the Tongariro power scheme, I reckon they pinched 18 inches of water out of the river because being involved in sea cadets in those days, we had to wait for a spring low tide to extend our slipway, Now at low tide, the slip rate's a metre out of the water. So where has that water gone?
Whanganui iwi spent 10 years in litigation with Genesis to try to stop the Tongariro Power Scheme from taking the river's headwaters, but to no avail. In a bid to keep out of the courts, the parties signed an agreement in 2010 which allows for more kōrero or discussions about matters of disagreement. A canoe guide, Charles Ranginui, says the power scheme disrupts the flow and life force of the awa from the mountain to the sea. He says sometimes the river looks sick.
Say the early 70s with mum and dad fishing up at Koronisi and Atani, you know, and fishing the old way with the tunapā and, you know, the stones, and would catch a bucket in a scoop, 20-litre bucket in one scoop, compared to like now, you're lucky to get a handful.
The former mayor, Annette Main, says the brown colour of the river gives it a reputation for being dirty.
We had an event here a couple of weeks ago and I heard parents saying, you know, was it safe for their children to be taking part in the triathlon in the river? And you know, I just said, look, it's just silt. It's silt that's run off the hills that we cleared. It's not unhealthy.
Whanganui iwi just passed its treaty settlement, which gave the river special status. Mrs Main says she hopes that will mean more focus is given to cleaning the river up. But she says the Tongariro Power Scheme doesn't help.
They not only take the water away and put it into another catchment, but they also take away a lot of the stones and kind of material that helps flush the river. So I do think it has its effects.
Genesis Energy have resource consent to divert the river's headwaters for another 22 years. The company would not be interviewed but said in a statement that it acknowledges Whanganui iwi's opposition to the Tongariro Power Scheme, but an agreement is in place with the iwi to discuss these matters.